At first, it sounded like a massive win for gun owners. An emergency court filing, a late-night order, headlines exploding across social media. Breaking, emergency gun rights decision, Supreme Court steps in, major victory for armed drivers. But most people completely missed the part that actually mattered, because buried inside this decision was a warning. And if you carry a firearm in your vehicle, legally, this warning affects you immediately. Not next year, not after some future case, right now. Especially the next time those lights appear behind you. Because this ruling did not just change what police can do, it changed what officers are now being trained to look for. And that difference is where a lot of innocent drivers are about to get themselves into serious trouble without even realizing it. A former officer once described traffic stops involving firearms this way. The gun usually isn't what escalates the stop, the driver does. And honestly, that's exactly what this Supreme Court decision is forcing people to confront. Because the court just drew a very specific constitutional line, a line most drivers don't understand, a line that protects you, right up until the moment you accidentally cross it yourself. And the scary part is, most people cross it in under 60 seconds. Before we break down the ruling itself, subscribe right now if you follow gun rights, police encounters, Supreme Court decisions, or legal awareness content like this. This channel covers these rulings the moment they happen, not 6 months later after somebody learns the hard way on the side of a highway. Now here's what happened. Late Friday night, the Supreme Court issued an emergency decision tied to firearm-related vehicle searches during traffic stops. And while the headlines focused on gun rights, the actual issue was much bigger than that. The court was dealing with a growing problem happening across the country during ordinary traffic stops. A driver gets pulled over, maybe for speeding, maybe for a broken taillight, maybe because a license plate light was out. Normal stop. Then the officer learns there's a firearm in the vehicle, and suddenly, the entire tone changes. You can actually see this happen in body cam footage all over the internet. The officer becomes more alert, questions become more detailed, the interaction slows down, backup sometimes gets called. And in many situations, officers were beginning to argue that the mere presence of a firearm created enough concern to justify expanding the stop or searching parts of the vehicle. That's where the constitutional issue started. Because millions of Americans legally carry firearms every single day, and courts were being forced to answer one very uncomfortable question. Can exercising your Second Amendment rights become the reason your Fourth Amendment protections disappear? That question finally reached the Supreme Court. And the ruling shocked legal analysts because the decision came back overwhelmingly in favor of constitutional limits. The court made something very clear. A legally possessed firearm, by itself, does not automatically create probable cause for a vehicle search. That line matters more than most people realize, because for years, a lot of drivers assumed the danger was the firearm itself. It isn't. The real danger starts after the officer sees how you behave once the firearm enters the conversation. That's what this entire ruling quietly revolves around. Behavior, pressure, movement, nervousness, contradictory answers, consent. That's why this decision is so important. It protects lawful possession, but it does not protect panic. And those are two very different things. This is where innocent people start making mistakes. You get pulled over. Your heart rate spikes instantly. Maybe your firearm is inside the center console. Maybe it's under the seat. Maybe it's in the glove compartment next to your registration. Now your brain starts racing. Should I tell him immediately? What if I reach too fast? What if he sees it first? What if I say the wrong thing? And the moment panic takes over, people start doing strange things. Talking too much, over-explaining, moving suddenly, reaching without warning, trying too hard to appear cooperative. Former officers talk about this constantly. A nervous, innocent driver often behaves more unpredictably than an actual criminal. Not because they're dangerous, because stress destroys normal thinking. That's why many defense attorneys say the most important part of a traffic stop is often the first 30 seconds. Not the search, not the questioning, the first 30 seconds. Because officers begin forming impressions immediately. And according to multiple legal experts discussing this ruling, the Supreme Court was trying to stop one specific constitutional problem, treating lawful gun ownership itself as suspicious behavior. The court essentially said, no, that alone is not enough. But here's where people misunderstand the ruling. The court did not say officers can never search a vehicle involving a firearm. That's not what happened. And honestly, believing that is exactly how people end up escalating encounters themselves. The ruling protects lawful possession alone. The second additional factors appear, everything changes. And this is the part YouTube headlines never explain properly. Let's say an officer smells marijuana, or sees open alcohol containers, or notices inconsistent statements between passengers, or sees somebody reaching aggressively toward the floorboard, or notices visible drug paraphernalia, or believes the driver is impaired. Now the firearm becomes part of a larger probable cause analysis. And legally, that changes the situation entirely. This is why experienced attorneys constantly warn people not to treat Supreme Court rulings like magical force fields. Constitutional protections are strongest when you stay calm enough to avoid creating additional problems yourself. That's the hidden lesson underneath this entire case. And honestly, this is where most drivers fail. Not because they're criminals, because adrenaline takes over. You can watch this happen in real body cam footage. An officer asks, "Any weapons in the vehicle?" The driver instantly starts rambling. "Yeah, but it's legal, I swear. I have a permit. I forgot it was there. It belongs to my cousin. I wasn't doing anything." The officer hasn't even accused them of anything yet, but panic makes people talk themselves into a worse situation. And the more they talk, the more nervous they sound. This is why legal experts constantly repeat the same advice. Calm communication matters more than most people realize. Not aggressive, not argumentative, not overly submissive, calm, controlled, predictable, because officers are constantly evaluating uncertainty during traffic stops, especially at night, especially when firearms are involved, especially when movement becomes unpredictable. One former highway patrol officer described it this way: "The stop usually escalates when we stop understanding what the driver is about to do." That line explains almost everything. Uncertainty creates tension, and tension changes interactions fast. This Supreme Court decision indirectly reinforces that reality. The court protected constitutional rights, but it also quietly reaffirmed that officers can still react to behavior they reasonably interpret as threatening, suspicious, or connected to other criminal activity. And honestly, this is where social media completely misleads people. A lot of creators online push this fantasy version of traffic stops where people start debating constitutional law on the roadside like they're arguing inside a courtroom. That is almost always a terrible idea. The side of a highway at midnight is not where constitutional arguments get won. Courts decide constitutional violations later. Your job during the stop is keeping the situation calm enough to get there safely. That distinction matters a lot. Now, here's another major part of this ruling people are missing: consent. Because even after this Supreme Court decision, consent can still completely change the situation. And this is where countless drivers accidentally surrender protections they thought they had. An officer might say something like, "You don't mind if I take a quick look, right?" Notice how casual that sounds. Not aggressive, not confrontational, just conversational. And under pressure, many innocent people instantly say yes. Why? Because refusing feels uncomfortable. People worry refusal makes them look guilty. But courts have repeatedly recognized that refusing consent alone does not automatically create probable cause. That's important, and many defense attorneys strongly recommend people understand the difference between being cooperative and waiving rights voluntarily. Those are not the same thing. You can be respectful without consenting to searches. You can remain calm without volunteering unnecessary information. You can comply with lawful instructions without escalating the encounter emotionally. That balance matters a lot more than people think. Because once a driver becomes emotionally reactive, the interaction usually gets worse. Fast. Now, something else happened after this ruling came down. Law enforcement agencies immediately started reviewing vehicle stop procedures tied to lawful firearm possession. That part didn't make headlines, but it matters. Because whenever the Supreme Court limits one type of justification, officers naturally become more focused on other observable indicators. Meaning, behavior matters now more than ever. Movement, tone, consistency, visibility of hands, responses to instructions. That's why experienced firearm instructors constantly teach drivers the same thing. Avoid surprises. Surprises create tension. Tension creates escalation, and escalation changes everything. Think about it from the officer's perspective for a second. It's dark. Traffic is flying past. They're approaching an unknown vehicle. They don't know who's inside. They don't know intentions. They don't know emotional state. Then suddenly somebody reaches quickly toward a glove compartment where a firearm is located. Even if completely innocent, that moment becomes dangerous fast. This is why many experts recommend informing officers calmly before reaching toward areas containing firearms or documents. Not because you're surrendering rights, because clear communication reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty lowers tension. That's the psychological reality underneath almost every successful traffic stop involving lawful gun owners. Predictability, not panic. Now, legally speaking, this emergency ruling is already being described as one of the most important recent decisions involving vehicle searches and firearm possession. Not because it radically expanded gun rights overnight, because it reinforced constitutional limits during ordinary encounters involving ordinary people. That's why the case matters. Most Americans don't interact with the Supreme Court through dramatic criminal trials. They interact with Supreme Court decisions through everyday moments: traffic stops, vehicle searches, questions from officers, split-second decisions made under stress. That's where constitutional law becomes real. And honestly, that's what makes this ruling so important. It reminds people that rights and behavior are connected. You can legally possess a firearm and still accidentally escalate an encounter through panic. You can legally carry and still create problems by overtalking. You can be completely innocent and still make an officer deeply uncomfortable through unpredictable behavior. That's not anti-police. That's not anti-gun. That's human psychology under stress. And the Supreme Court just forced the country to confront it directly. Because at its core, this ruling says something simple. Lawful gun ownership alone is not a crime, not suspicious, not automatic probable cause, not automatic justification for expanded searches. But the ruling also quietly highlights something equally important. The moment human behavior changes, the legal analysis changes too. That's the part most headlines leave out. And honestly, that's probably the part people need to hear most. Because the drivers who usually handle these stops best are not the loudest people online. They're the calmest, the most controlled, the most predictable. The people who understand that staying emotionally steady during pressure is often the single most important thing happening during the entire interaction. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from this Supreme Court decision. Not fear, not outrage, awareness. Because constitutional rights matter most in moments where emotions are highest. Blue lights in the mirror, dark highway, adrenaline kicking in, questions being asked. That's where people either stay calm or accidentally start creating the very problems they were trying to avoid in the first place.